Yellow fellas, today we are doing something different. I just finished reading On Contradiction by Mao Zedong, and I thought, you know what? Why don't we just talk about On Contradiction by Mao Zedong? On Contradiction by Mao Zedong is easily, in my opinion, one of the greatest introduction texts to not only dialectical materialism, but also Mao in this text is able to summarize hundreds of years of philosophy, Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, just all these philosophical currents in less than 50-ish pages, right? It's such an amazing work that's so easy for even the simplest peasant who was reading this at the time, the Chinese peasants and party members in China who were just new to understand. You know, it really is a great work in which he is able to take these very, very complex things, right? Metaphysics, dialectical materialism, and explain them in ways that you can sort of grasp as a beginner. And I will say, if you are thinking about pursuing a career degree in philosophy, getting a bachelor's, going to university, forget about it. Just read On Contradiction by Mao Zedong. It's less than 50 pages, you know. I'm just kidding, of course. But I'm not gonna lie, fellas. I was coming while reading this. You know, like this is my third time reading this, and I was coming, like literally, it was so good. So I'm just going to talk about some of the general ideas within On Contradiction today. But first of all, some background. So why was On Contradiction written? It was written by Mao Zedong in 1937 in order to correct a lot of the dogmatist errors that he saw that a lot of party comrades were following. Mao was always a man who was always trying to correct dogmatist errors. He was always trying to correct people who didn't read enough theory and were too focused on practice. He was always a man who was trying to correct minor framework errors within his party that a lot of people and new communists and communists who are not that well-rounded often fall into in order to create as robust of a communist party as possible. You know, Mao was always obsessed with these things. You know, it was, if you read about Mao and all of the possible, if you've ever read Mao and all of the possible errors that he identified that a communist can fall into, your head starts spinning, right? It's this error, it's that error, it's a dogmatist error, it's a that error, it's a that, you know, he was, your head starts spinning about how many errors Mao identified, but it's important. You know, a lot of the errors that he identified are important in, you know, commandism. We shouldn't be simply just leading the proletariat. We should actually be working with the proletariat. We should be listening to what the proletariat wants. We shouldn't be leading the proletariat like dictators who don't listen to them. I mean, communism has to be democratic. And Mao always identified these errors. So it was just meant to really tackle a lot of dogmatist errors that he was finding in the early CPC. Mao begins On Contradiction by stating that contradictions are the basis of the Marxist world framework and the outlook of dialectical materialism, which is the scientific tool and framework that Marxists use to observe not only human societies, but the universe itself. So, what is this contradiction that Mao is talking about? A contradiction, he'll go into it further, but it's two sort of things that stand against each other, right? Within a system, right? So, but it can be as broad. It's a very broad definition, but in the basis of it, it's two things that stand on the opposite of each other, and it doesn't have to be necessarily antagonistic. Mao explains this further, but it's two things within something, within a system, that stand on an opposite. That's how I'll give you sort of a beginning framework. And so the first section of On Contradiction is called The Two World Outlooks, and in this, Mao goes over the history of philosophy itself, right? And he explains the common philosophy that has dominated humanity and is the root of liberalism, and that is the metaphysical outlook of the world. So throughout human history, he explains there have always been two ways of looking and interpreting the world: the metaphysical outlook and the dialectical outlook. And Marxists, of course, use the dialectical. Liberals use the metaphysical. So the metaphysical outlook has always been an idealist outlook. What does idealist mean? It means it's not rooted in reality. It's rooted in idealism. The Marxist basis of the worldview, the Marxist basis for our worldview is that the material world is the basis for everything. And then that affects our brains. And then our brains, right, whatever is in our head, then goes on to change the material world. But the material world is a basis for everything, right, within Marxism, the world around us. The idealist outlook says that the mind is the most important thing in the universe, that the mankind's mind, the mind over matter, if you ever heard that term, is the most important thing. And so it's always been an idealist outlook, one that does not reflect a scientific understanding of reality. Meanwhile, the Marxist materialist scientific outlook, which is materialist dialectics, came out of the Industrial Revolution, the creation of the proletariat, and human advancements in science, which allowed Marx and Engels to formulate dialectical materialism and allowed humanity to look at the world with new eyes. Right? So there's a lot of terms going on here, but really what Mao means is that for most of humanity was sort of in a primitive way of looking at the world. Man always thought of the world through a metaphysical outlook in which the mind was more important than matter, right? Think about myths, right? The earliest societies, these animalistic myths that they had, these religious myths that they had, and even the liberal outlook now. The liberal outlook now is almost like a Marvel movie. Right? This is this idealist way of looking at the world where Russia is bad because Russia just doesn't think like us. Right? Like Russia is bad because Russia just doesn't choose the good side in our Marvel movie and we're on the good side of the Marvel movie. It's an idealist outlook. Marxist says, well, there's this trade deficit and there's this materialist contradiction and there's this basis in reality for why Russia acts how it acts. Idealist doesn't do that. Idealist just says, oh, Russia just acts like that because they think like that, right? They just want to be bad. They have a bad thoughts in their heads, right? So I hope that this isn't too above your head, but I'm trying to get to this as basically as possible. The metaphysical outlook contends on the idea that things themselves are unchanging and permanent. Right? That any change whatsoever that happens in the universe is simply due to external factors. So there is no internal mechanism within things. Everything in the universe is simply due to external factors. It rejects the idea that systems within the universe have internal contradictions, and that this is what moves the world. This is what moves the universe. For example, metaphysicians such as liberals believe that humanity has always been capitalism, right? When humanity was in its slave mode of production, Mesopotamia, Rome, Greece, antiquity, when humanity was in its feudal mode of production, what capitalists do is they look into the past and they see capitalism having always existed within humanity. Right? They even look at the hunter-gatherer societies and they look at, for example, horrible tribal warfares and they say, this is the basis of human greed. Humanity has always had that capitalist, greedy mindset. And that's the basis of the metaphysical outlook. There is no such thing as an internal system. There's no such thing as an internal contradiction. And everything in the universe is almost sort of pseudo-permanent. Right? Liberalism is always permanent. Liberalism has always been here. This is how liberalism has always been. And metaphysicians say, liberals say, liberalism came about, in America because George Washington believed in freedom, right? A Marxist says liberalism came in America because the colonists of America were in a trade deficit and they needed to, the native bourgeois of America found it more economically suitable to just protect their own economic interests as opposed to continuing to be a colony of Britain. And then ideology came from that, right? That material basis of economic protection, right? It's just making sense to separate from Britain. Then on top of that came that bullshit ideology about freedom for every man and equality for all men. That is the dialectical outlook of the world, right? It recognizes this internal contradiction. That internal contradiction was this native bourgeois that was growing within America that was being fucked over by Britain. And also being kept from growing because Britain didn't allow American colonists to go past the Appalachian Mountains. And so they needed to gain independence. And so after that came the ideological justification. But liberalism says the ideological justification is the only thing that ever existed, and that was that the founders of America just wanted freedom and liberty and equality for all mankind, and then they got their independence and they won through their good feelings. That's the metaphysical versus dialectical contention in the world. So these people believe that capitalism has always existed, and that there is no such thing as a contradiction within capitalism itself. They don't believe in class warfare. They don't believe in the class warfare between the bourgeois and the proletariat, which is one of the most important contradictions within capitalism, right? This class that has everything, this class, this economic class that owns the means of production, that owns the majority of the wealth, and the majority of humanity who owns none of the wealth, who sells their labor power to the bourgeois. A great example of metaphysical thinking that Mao brings up is this noble man feudal saying in China, heaven changeth not, likewise Tao changeth not, right? So heaven does not change, Tao does not change, right? So ideology doesn't change. The world stays permanent forever, right? You know, this Chinese saying from these Chinese noblemen, these feudal noblemen that he brings up, it really perfectly exemplifies metaphysics and how it operates within the world. And so Mao says, and I quote, as opposed to the metaphysical world outlook, the world outlook of materialist dialectics holds that in order to understand the development of a thing, we should study it internally and in its relation with other things. In other words, the development of things should not be seen as their internal and necessary. The development of things should be seen as their internal and necessary self-movement, while each thing in its movement is interrelated with and interacts with other things around it. The fundamental cause of development of a thing is not external, but internal. It lies in the contradictoriness within the thing. There is an internal contradiction in every single thing, hence its motion and development. Contradictoriness within a thing is the fundamental cause of its development. And so this is a really important line. Mao delivers the fundamentals of materialist dialectics. That, yes, external factors do have an influence on things, right? External factors do have an influence on how systems change, but external factors only have effects on systems through their already pre-existing internal contradictions. The way that external factors operate on systems is within contradictions that they already have. And this ultimately differs radically from metaphysical thinking, which is unable to see contradictions within any system, and is only able to see changes from the outside. While materialist dialectics does not reject external forces, it recognizes that those forces heavily play off of those already existing internal contradictions, and Mao emphasizes that contradictions are the basis of everything within the universe, from life to motion itself. All things operate because of contradictions within themselves, right? Chemistry, physics, motion, these are all based on contradictions. Mathematics itself, right? Think about positive numbers and negative numbers. These are a contradiction. And these things like this are the basis of mathematics, the laws of physics, universe, and human societies. And so this is the scientific outlook that the Marxists use to examine the world, called dialectical materialism. What makes dialectical materialism great is that it allows us to see how Imperial Russia, through its own internal contradictions, could change into the Soviet Union. And then from the Soviet Union, through the contradictions of revisionism, into modern-day capitalist Russia. Or feudal Japan into Imperial Japan, because of the victories and successes, changes within a system's own logics. All changes within the universe from nature to society happen because of internal contradictions that play out ultimately. And so Mao goes on to say that, quote, changes in society are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in society. That is, the contradiction between productive forces and the relations of production, the contradiction between classes and the contradiction between the old and the new. It is the development of these contradictions that pushes society forward and gives the impetus for the suppression of old society by the new. And so there's a lot of things going on here. So Mao examines what the major contradictions of human societies are, right? So we've already gone over contradictions within physics, mathematics, things like that. But what are the main contradictions within human societies in general? Well, one of the main contradictions within human societies are productive forces. So what are productive forces? They're the technological level of a society, right? Is it a hunter-gatherer society? Is it a feudal society? How do you produce commodities? How do you produce things within the society? Currently, we live within the Industrial Revolution, even like sort of a post-industrial revolution, technological computer revolution. And so, people are even arguing that AI itself is a new industrial revolution. Who can really say? But we're living within the era of certainly an industrial revolution and post-industrial revolution. So those are the productive forces. And so there's a great contradiction between what the productive forces are and the relations of those productive forces, right? Who owns those productive forces? For what purpose are they used for? What class uses the productive forces and what class does not use the productive forces? And currently under capitalism, the bourgeois, which is a tiny percentage of humanity, owns the productive forces, which produce commodities for 99%, the large extent of humanity, the majority of humanity, and employ, right? The productive forces employ, because we sell our labor power to the bourgeois, unless you're a small business owner, or yourself a business owner. We sell our labor to the bourgeois. These productive forces employ the vast majority of humanity. And so there's a great contradiction between how the productive forces are used, right? Something that could benefit the majority of humanity. We currently produce, for example, more than enough food to feed everybody on Earth. Isn't that crazy? We produce enough food to feed everybody on Earth. Or another example, we currently have more than enough houses to house every single American. We currently have 16 million empty houses and only 600,000 homeless people. And of course, that's an undercount. The government purposely counts homeless people in a way that is an undercount. But even then, if we're doing twice, 3 times the number, we have more than enough empty homes to house the majority of the people. So we have these productive forces that have been able to produce more than enough to create an almost post-scarcity world. We're not quite there yet, but an almost post-scarcity world, and yet we have so much artificial scarcity. So that is productive forces versus the relations of production. That is one contradiction of capitalism. And then there's also the contradiction between classes, right? The bourgeois and the proletariat, I already went over that. One is in power, and one is not in power. One uses the state as a tool of suppression, right? That's the bourgeois. Police, military, the tools of the state, essentially. And one gets the tools of the state used against them, right? Think about, for example, the Battle of Blair Mountain, right? Where miners were killed by militarized U.S. government forces for daring to do a union strike. There you go. That's a contradiction between classes. And it is the development of contradictions that pushes society forward. So that's a great analysis by Mao. So how these contradictions ultimately play out, is it an antagonistic contradiction? And contradictions don't always need to be antagonistic. Sometimes there can be a contradiction in society that isn't necessarily a fight between two forces of society, right? It doesn't need to resolve itself through a violent fight. Of course, class contradiction does, generally. But there are some contradictions, such as, for example, the proletariat and the peasantry within the Soviet Union. This was a contradiction. One lived within cities, one lived within a rural life in a feudal mode of production, and one lived within almost the 21st century, or the 20th century. It was the 20th century. And yet this contradiction within the Soviet Union was resolved through an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry, rather than a direct confrontation. And so a contradiction doesn't always need to be antagonistic. But for example, the contradiction between the bourgeois, who are the rulers, and the proletariat, who are the ruled, does need to be antagonistic. And the way that these contradictions play out, the way that these contradictions resolve themselves, because a contradiction has to resolve itself somehow eventually, is what pushes a society forward and gives the impetus for the supersession of an old society for a new society. This is how we create revolutions. A revolution really is the resolving of a buildup of contradictions over hundreds of years, centuries, decades, what have you. And it's what allows new people to go from the ruled to ruler, right? To go from being ruled over to ruling people. Dialectical materialism, as I've said before, does not reject external forces and how they change, but instead they see them operating through the internal contradictions of systems, right? So think about imperialism, for example. Imperialism very often operated within, like, let's say, the Indian subcontinent through the internal contradictions that were already existent within the Indian subcontinent, which was, these feudal warlords that were always fighting each other in sort of the post Mughal breakup. And so the British imperialists would play off these Indian warlords off of each other and played a game of divide and conquer. There you go. That's a perfect example. Or even, further on within Indian society, the British would have Muslims and Hindus often fight each other, right? They would push for divisions within Indian society. There you go. Britain is an external imperial force, but it's operating through the internal contradictions of Indian society. And Mao describes this in this way, quote, "In a suitable temperature, an egg changes into a chicken," right? So the temperature is the external force, the egg yolk is the internal force. "But no temperature can change a stone into a chicken because each has a different basis." The stone doesn't have internal contradictions. So no matter if you put that stone into 0°C or 24°C, I don't know the right temperature to hatch a chicken. If you do know, please comment it. And in Celsius. No matter what temperature you put a stone in, because a stone does not have internal contradictions within it, it's never going to hatch a chicken. And that's a perfect way to describe this. This is why I literally felt myself coming. I'm not even going to lie, fellas. I literally felt myself coming when I read that metaphor. Like buckets. And so external forces such as the victory of the October Revolution in Russia made communism popular within the world over and extended its influence over other societies like China. And so the external force of, say, the communist revolution within Russia played within China's own internal logics and contradictions, such as a contradiction of being a semi-colonial country, contradictions between peasants and landlords, and produced the Chinese Revolution. And in the era of global capitalism, interactions such as these external, internal interactions happen all the time on a globalized scale, especially in an imperialist world. Section 2, the universality of contradiction. Mao in this section tries to explain how contradiction is a universal law. And so what he attempts to do is go from a general broad concept to a more specificity. Right, so this is how Marxists often explain their things. People often say that the beginning of Das Kapital is completely unreadable. And it's because Marxists often like to start from the very cell of a system or a concept and then build up to the entire body, right? If you read any biology textbook, it always begins with cells, right? It always begins with the tiniest things, DNA, cells, nucleus, and then it builds up to bigger things like organs, and then it builds up to bigger things, human bodies, and then it builds up to bigger things, ecosystems. That's how most high school biology textbooks are written in America. And that's also how Marxists often try to explain things. Marxist Das Kapital starts out with commodities, and then it moves on to money, and then it moves on to trade, and then it moves on to bigger things like, for example, the primitive accumulation of capitalism, right? Which is how Marx explains how capitalism did immense violence in order to get its private property in its transition from feudalism to capitalism, right? And so Mao's trying to do exactly that. He's trying to go from universal, as broad of a definition of contradiction as possible, to as specific, just to help you better. And so contradiction, Mao says, is a universal law. Everything from motion to natural laws to, just everything you can think of follow internal contradictions. But not only this, they exist within interdependent opposites within each system, right? So within every system, contradictions are both interdependent, right? They both depend on each other, but they are also opposites, right? And so for this, to explain this a little better, I'll use a quote by Stalin. In Stalin's great work on dialectical materialism, Stalin said about the contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat, but having developed productive forces to a tremendous extent, capitalism has become enmeshed in contradictions which it is unable to solve. By producing larger and larger quantities of commodities and reducing their prices, capitalism intensifies competition, ruins the mass of small and medium private owners, converts them into proletarians, and reduces their purchasing power, with the result that it becomes impossible to dispose of the commodities produced. On the other hand, by expanding production and concentrating millions of workers into huge mills and factories, capitalism lends the process of production a social character and thus undermines its own foundation, insomuch as the social character of the process of production demands a social ownership of the means of production, yet the means of production remain private, capitalist property, which is incompatible with the social character of the process of production itself. These irreconcilable contradictions between the character of the productive forces and the relation of production makes themselves felt in periodic crises of overproduction, when the capitalists, finding no effective demand for their own goods owing to the ruin of the mass of population which they themselves have brought about, are compelled to burn products, destroy manufactured goods, suspend production, and destroy the productive forces at a time when millions of people are forced to suffer unemployment and starvation. Right, so what I was talking about before, millions of empty homes, while we've got 600,000 homeless people, and even if we double or triple that, we've got more than enough homes, empty homes within America. Not because there are not enough goods, but because there is an overproduction of goods. This means that the capitalist relation of productions have ceased to correspond to the state of productive forces of society, and have come into irreconcilable contradiction with them. This means that capitalism is pregnant with a revolution whose mission it is to replace the existing capitalist ownership of the means of production by socialist ownership. This means that the main feature of the capitalist system is a most acute class struggle between exploiters and the exploited. So what Stalin is basically saying is that the proletariat and the bourgeois are two classes, right? They're in opposition to each other. They're opposites, right? The bourgeois own everything. The proletariat own nothing. The bourgeois buy labor power. The proletariat sell their labor power to the bourgeois. And yet they're also interdependent. Without a bourgeois, there's no proletariat. Without a proletariat, there's no bourgeois. These two need each other in order to be defined as themselves. And yet they're also in complete opposition to each other. And so this is what Mao means by being opposite but interdependent. Some examples of the universality of contradiction that Mao brings up is that in mathematics, there's positive numbers and negative numbers, differentials and integrals. In mechanics, there's action and reaction. In physics, there's positive and negative electricity. In chemistry, there's the combination and dissociation of atoms. And in science, social science, in the study of humanity, in the study of human societies, the contradiction is class struggle. Mao, during this section, also very heavily rips Soviet philosopher Abraham de Borin. So why does he go so into Abraham de Borin, who is mostly in the modern day an obscure philosopher? It's because Abraham de Borin at this time, his writings were circulating in the 30s, in the late 30s. They were circulating all throughout communist circles in the Soviet Union and the world abroad. He was eventually suppressed by Stalin. And then later on, de Borin's ideas were published openly under Khrushchev, which should give you an idea of what de Borin really stood for. But de Borin rejected that contradictions existed in the beginnings of systems. And they only became existent when those systems further developed. And so de Borin was trying to argue that there were no contradictions in, example, the Soviet Union, and there were no contradictions in the beginning stages of some liberal societies, such as China, right? So feudal societies that were just getting into liberalism, capitalism. De Boer was arguing that there's no contradictions because it hasn't gotten to capitalism yet, so it was a very anti-Marxist idea. And Mao would say that contradiction always exists. There's no stage where contradiction does not. It's just that they may not heighten enough to seem obvious at the beginning of a system. So contradiction exists in the early stages of capitalism, no matter what. A contradiction exists in the early stages of every system, right? There's a contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat in the early systems of capitalism. It's just that it's less hard to see, right? In the early stages of capitalism, the bourgeois is more of a small bourgeois. There's no monopolies yet, right? It's many businessmen fighting each other. And so it's really hard to see this big hulking beast later on, finance monopoly capitalism, where these big companies come to envelop whole spheres of production, right? Tyson or Disney or AT&T, right? Which have cornered entire markets and become these big hulking beasts. And suddenly there's this big difference between the bourgeois and the proletariat. During the beginning of capitalism, there's not that much of a difference as obvious between the bourgeois and the proletariat. But it still exists. That contradiction still exists. It's just harder to see when it's just some asshole running a flour mill in Sheffield, England. I don't know anything about Sheffield, but there you go. And even though they may not seem obvious, the USSR even still has a contradiction. For example, between the proletariat and the peasantry, which is what Mao says. But this contradiction is kept from outright antagonism by an alliance between the two. And that's what the Soviet Revolution really was. It was an alliance between the peasantry and the proletariat against the bourgeois of Russia and the noble classes of Russia. So de Boer and his more liberal interpretation of Marxism, no good. Fuck him. We're glad that he's no longer known. And Mao rightfully rips into him. Okay, so section 3, the particularity of contradiction. In this section, Mao blasts dogmatists within the Communist Party of China that are unable to think within the particularities of contradiction, right? So they're unable to examine specific contradictions that are specific to certain contexts. Instead, they just lazily apply universally answers to certain contradictions without thinking or studying the particularities of a contradiction. So, for example, a lazy dogmatist within China would say, the Soviet Union's revolution heavily focused on the proletariat, so we within China should focus on the proletariat and not the peasantry. Well, within China, eventually, the revolution was won by the peasantry as the main revolutionary class. Unlike Soviet Russia, the peasantry was the main revolutionary class. And so that was a particular contradiction within China that had to be studied within the Chinese context. What the dogmatists did was they just looked lazily at Soviet answers to their own contradictions, and they said, this is how it works all over the world, no matter what. This is where you really get your dogmatist Marxists, the Bordigists, who look at answers that Marx gave in this 1800s Victorian England industrial context and apply it lazily to our modern day context of imperialism, neocolonialism, and neocolonial context. Saying that, for example, the PFLP or Palestinian liberation, for example, for a modern day context, Bordigists often claim that Palestinian liberation is just a bourgeois contradiction, liberation, and that we should not support Palestinian statehood at all. That there should be a third branch, a socialist branch that doesn't support war between Israel and Palestine at all. And so instead of looking at the contradiction within its peculiarity, which is Palestine as a state that's resisting settler colonialism, and therefore needing a national liberation, they just take Marx's words and just apply it lazily. And this is what Mao is really warning against. The way that a contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat is solved is socialist revolution. The way that ideological contradiction is solved is within communist parties, is with debate or even purges. The way that contradiction between peasant and proletariat is solved is alliance. These are the ways that specific contradictions generally tend to solve themselves. However, in different contexts and different societies, the answers are always different. And dogmatists don't ever look at the particularities of societies and what they need. Again, the Bordigas. And instead, they take a universalistic approach where they just lazily apply the answers of one society or one analysis everywhere without studying its particularities. Many contradictions can also play themselves out at the same time within major historical movements or systems. So no system has just one contradiction. There's always several contradictions going on within every single society. For example, within capitalist society, you have the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeois. But you even have secondary contradictions, right? There's a race contradiction within American society, a contradiction between whites and blacks. Never think of a system as having just one simple contradiction. There's always contradictions, multiple contradictions playing out within every single society. Mao brings up the example that China had a contradiction between, as a semi-colonized country, it had contradiction between the colonized and the colonizers, the Chinese people and the Europeans, European imperial powers, the peasants and the landlords, and the proletariat and the bourgeois, right? And even so many more contradictions. Likewise, in order to fully understand all contradictions within societies, you have to look at both sides fully. Study both sides of a society. Thoroughly study a society in order to do your analysis. Do not become subjective, one-sided, and unscientific in our materialist dialectical outlook. Of course, it's impossible to fully study a society to get a good grasp of contradictions, right? Nobody's ever going to be able to 100% study American society or any society, but you have to get as close as possible to a good study of a society, every single angle and side, so you're not one-sided, so you're not subjective, so your analysis of contradictions is not based on a subjectivist approach, and it's unscientific. Mao explains that there is always a fundamental contradiction within every society, so the main contradiction. Within capitalist societies, usually it's the class struggle, right, between bourgeois and proletariat. But there's also secondary contradictions between other than the primary contradiction. So, for instance, as Mao says, quote, when the capitalism of the era of free competition developed into imperialism, there was no change in the class nature of the two classes in fundamental contradiction, namely the proletariat and the bourgeois. So the fundamental contradiction stays the same, even as capitalist society transitions to imperialism. Or in the case of capitalism essence of society, however, the contradiction between these two classes became intensified. The contradiction between monopoly and non-monopoly capital emerged. So there suddenly became a contradiction between small business owners and big business owners. The contradiction between colonial powers and colonies became intensified. So there was suddenly a contradiction between the imperial core, right? So Europe, the colonizers, Great Britain, America, and the colonized, India, Asia, China, Africa. The contradiction among capitalist countries themselves resulting from their uneven development manifested itself with particular sharpness, and thus there arose a special state of capitalism called the stage of imperialism. Leninism is the Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution, precisely because Lenin and Stalin have correctly explained that these contradictions and correctly formulated the theory and the tactics of the proletariat for the resolution. So Mao explains how these secondary contradictions become important to analyze, become just as important to understand, and sometimes even become themselves primary driving forces. For example, we are currently in the age of imperialism. So Marxism has to fundamentally change its world outlook while still maintaining the fundamental contradiction between bourgeois and proletariat, but also has to now contend with imperialism, which is a new secondary contradiction that resulted from capitalist class struggle that adds a new flavor to our analyses. Ultimately, it is important to both recognize the secondary contradictions that came and how they changed how capitalism functioned, but also not forget that fundamental contradiction at the root of all of these, which is still within the capitalist context class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat, right? Let's not fall into, let's say, the American Communist Party and Eddie Liger claiming that Marx was not against private property, right? You know, what error that the American Communist Party made in that comment, and Eddie Liger made in that comment, was that he started to fail to understand the principal contradiction of capitalism. He got so entrenched within the secondary contradictions, right? Imperialism, neocolonialism, what have you, that he forgot the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, which is still private ownership, which is still the class struggle. And so his interpretation of Marx became not even Marx anymore. These non-principal contradictions, or secondary contradictions, you can call them, are what allowed, for example, the CPC to be in. These secondary contradictions are what allowed the CPC to go from civil war with the Kuomintang, which was their enemy. The Kuomintang were the nationalist, capitalist government of China. So they went from fighting the Kuomintang to temporary alliance with the Kuomintang against Japanese imperialism. So when the Japanese invaded, the CPC and the Kuomintang formed an alliance to fight the Japanese. And then as a non-principal contradictions or secondary contradictions changed within China, they went back to an antagonistic stance with the Kuomintang. So, you can see how secondary contradictions, right? The main contradiction always remained class struggle, but the secondary contradictions can change your analysis, change your strategies, change a lot of things. Chapter 4, or not chapter 4, but section 4, the principal contradiction and the principal aspect of a contradiction. And so Mao begins this section, and I want to read a quote to begin this section. Quote, "In capitalist society, the two forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeois, form the principal contradiction." So that's just what I was saying. The other contradictions, such as those between the remnant feudal classes and the bourgeois, between the peasant, petty bourgeois, and the bourgeoisie, between the proletariat and the petty bourgeois, between the non-monopoly capitalists and the monopoly capitalists, between bourgeois democracy and bourgeois fascism, among the capitalist countries and between imperialism and the colonies, all are determined or influenced by this principal contradiction, which is, class struggle. So, all these other fights, right? Landlord versus his tenant, fascist versus liberal, right? Which is a contradiction that solves itself pretty easily by alliance. Small business owner versus monopoly giant business owner. All of these are secondary contradictions to the principal contradiction, which is between the proletariat and the bourgeois, that class struggle between the workers and the bourgeois. But the principal contradiction can change in certain situations, temporarily. For example, when semi-feudal China became besieged by imperialist war, such as the Japanese war in World War II, which was horrible and killed millions upon millions of people, the primary contradiction became between imperialism and anti-imperialism. And so in that primary contradiction, that class struggle suddenly temporarily disappeared. And suddenly the petty bourgeois, the landlords, the peasants, everybody who was a Chinese person was suddenly in a total war against the Japanese. And so that main contradiction between proletariat and bourgeois temporarily, at least, sort of disappeared. And all these classes became in alliance with each other, right? So the communists were able to ally with the national bourgeois that were the Kuomintang. The peasants were able to ally with their landlords because everybody was being killed by the Japanese. Something very similar is happening in Palestine right now, and the Bordegas don't want to recognize that. Bordegas, what are you going to do? Imperialism is not when war... Imperialism... When imperialism is not in direct war, it often sees itself allying with the current rulers of countries, the comprador bourgeois. in order to help exploit the people further. And so in this, you can sort of see imperialism working off of the already existing internal contradictions of a society. Imperialism goes in, it looks at these bourgeois within the society, or the rulers of society, noblemen, and it plays off of them. It works with the noblemen. The noblemen become middlemen between this exchange of exploiting people. And so you can see this external force operating through internal forces that were already there. For example, the comprador bourgeois. You can think of sort of the Congo in the same way. American capital and Western capital. It works off of the internal contradictions of Congolese society and works with the comprador bourgeois of Congolese society in order to further exploit its people. So there was already this contradiction within Congolese society, and these outside forces, Apple, America, Europe, the EU, work off of these internal contradictions in order to further exploit the people. Contradictions play out within contention with each other. One always ends up usurping the other, which then fundamentally changes the system. This doesn't necessarily have to be antagonistic. One can usurp the other in alliance. For example, the peasants with the proletariat. Eventually, the peasant classes will be eliminated, but this can be done hand in hand with each other, which is a mutual benefit to each other. Capitalism used to be subordinate to feudalism, but eventually capitalism overcame it. And in doing so, it rapidly changed from a progressive force into a regressive force. And so you can sort of see how contradictions solve themselves, right? Capitalism was slowly rising out of the contradiction of feudalism, and eventually it overcame it through, say, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And in doing so, capitalism created a new set of contradictions. It was born out of the contradiction of feudal society. And once feudal society died, once capitalism usurped it, it itself expanded all new contradictions that never existed before. Within feudal society, the contradiction was between noblemen and peasant, between absolute kings and people who worked on land and paid taxes in their farms. And then suddenly, capitalism came about and created all new contradictions between these urban societies, mass factories, big businessmen, and proletarian. And so, and even within the free market capitalism itself, you saw small capitalists at the beginning, and there was a contradiction between them and big capitalists. And this contradiction eventually solved itself through the finance monopolies triumphing and converting capitalism from its small insular operations into a global imperialist capitalism, that we exist in with today. And you can sort of see these so on and so forth. Contradictions play themselves out, and one eventually wins, and then it creates a new system or a new contradiction along with it, if you understand that. From the victory of socialism, the proletariat will change itself from being the ruled to the ruler. And so therefore, it will change itself from the suppressed class to the dominant class. And the bourgeois will go from the dominant class to the suppressed class. And eventually, the bourgeois will die out, right? So you can see how the contradiction will play out and how it will be resolved. In this section, I'm drinking a Coke Zero. In this section, Mao even lays down the threads that Gramsci would even pick up later on in his analysis of the hegemony, right? And Gramsci's excellent analysis of how the superstructure affects the base. Because Mao lays down threads about how we must avoid mechanical materialism, which is where we only look simply at economic materialist motivations for systems, and we don't examine any of the cultural, institutional, governmental effects on systems, how these systems change the economic base itself, right? We remain firmly materialist. We recognize that the economic base, the productive forces, are the basis for all society, but we also recognize how culture can have it, culture, religion, things like that can also themselves change the productive forces. They can have their influence on the productive forces. And to not do that is mechanical materialism. And so Mao says that we must recognize that just because something does not play a primary role in the eternal operations of something, right? So religion doesn't play the primary role in our society. And of course, the world's becoming more and more atheistic. But let's say the 1950s, it didn't play the primary role within American society. It was the industrial behemoths of American society that played the dominant role. That does not mean that religion did not fundamentally, through its superstructure, also influence the economic base of society, right? So religion itself organized people in ways, influenced the ways that the protective forces exerted themselves through, for example, Christian moralism, Christian ideas that lend themselves to colonialism, right? Christian ideas of being God's chosen people and needing to conquer this land against Native Americans, things like that. And this really lays down beautifully threads that Gramsci would later pick on with his ideas of hegemony, ideas of how the superstructure needs more focus and is often not focused enough on, how people often have this mechanical materialism where they only focus on the material aspects of society and don't focus on how culture affects society, right? Which is beautiful. Number 5, the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction. So Mao also relates in this section how things often exist in direct opposition to each other. There cannot be, like I said, a proletariat without a bourgeois, or vice versa. There cannot be a bourgeois without a proletariat. There cannot be peasants without landlords. There cannot be landlords without peasants. There cannot be a colonized without a colonizer. There cannot be a colonized without a colonizer. And there cannot be life without death. Vice versa, there cannot be death without life. So contradictions are often in opposition with each other. And within most systems, there are multiple opposites. And within each opposite, they also identify each other. There's an identity created, right? So the proletariat are the ruled, the bourgeois are the rulers. And the way that these opposite contradictions solve themselves is that the proletariat goes from being the ruled to the ruler. So contradictions, through creating these identities, ruled, ruler, things like that, through being in these oppositions, allows for the opposition, the contradiction to be solved by flipping these identities on their heads, right? So the proletariat goes from being the ruled to the ruler under socialism, under socialistic revolution. That identity has been flipped on his head through forming an identity, and this contradiction being solved. These identities are flipped, and whoever was on the bottom of that identity suddenly takes on the opposite effect. For example, there's also the state under socialism transforms itself eventually into statelessness under a higher stage of communism. So a state identifies itself as being a state, as through existence, and its opposite identity is statelessness, right? No state existing. And so eventually the state takes on that polar identity of statelessness in the final stages of communism, right? When we transition from socialism to communism. War, its opposite identity is peace. And so when that contradiction is resolved, war transforms itself from war into peace. You can see how that identity plays off of each other, and war takes on that other identity. And so it's important to recognize how contradictions often form identities with each other, polar identities, and they often take on these identities once those contradictions are solved. And this process, Marxists call the identity of opposites. So if you want to look more into this, you can search up the identity of opposites. I hope that there's some Google searches for that. I will sort of see. Yes, thank you. There are. Yes, it's called the identity of opposites. There is a great googly moogly. There's a lot of articles about this. Okay, so there are a lot of articles about this. I was sort of speaking out of my ass right there. I'm not gonna lie. I was hoping that there were a couple articles explaining identity of opposites, and identity of opposites is an actual word, but it is. Ultimately, then, dialectical materialism is a recognition that all processes have a beginning and an end, and that is so important to recognize. The slave mode of production in humanity For example, Rome, antiquity, where humanity economy was based off of slaves, right? You know, you go to war, you get as many slaves as you can, you get some Greek femboys like sex slaves. It had a beginning. Eventually, it had an end, and it died, and it became feudalism with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Feudalism had a beginning with the collapse of the Roman Empire, and it had an end. You know, the transition from feudalism to capitalism is a little bit gray, but eventually, capitalism has a beginning, like let's say around the 1400s with the beginning of the conquest of America, and some of the private venture capitalist companies, the first joint stock companies within England, and it has a definitive end. You know, you can say it sort of already ended in 1917 or 1959 or 1950. Wait, when was the Chinese Revolution? It was 1953, I believe. Let's see. 1949. I'm sorry. 1949. And fundamentally, global capitalism itself will have an end one day. And socialism itself, it has a beginning in that revolution. It has an end to its transition to capitalism when it becomes stateless. And these processes transform themselves into their opposites, right? So capitalism, think about this. Capitalism has a private ownership of a means of production. And the opposite of that is everybody owning the means of production, right? A social meaning ownership of the means of production. And so the transition from capitalism to socialism would be its opposite. And socialism would take on the identity of capitalism, right? As the dominant ideology. So there you go. You can see how that contradiction and that opposite solves itself. And also from going from the subordinate economic system, right? Socialism is currently all across the world going under war. In China, in Cuba, great economic war, great buildup of war, great diplomatic war. And eventually it will be the dominant system. Well, we can hope. One can hope. You know, this is a very controlled experiment on paper. Who knows what will happen in the real world? Like maybe climate change will destroy all of us. I hope not. I hope not, but you know, we'll see. And the last section, the last chapter, the place of antagonism within contradiction. And so in this section, Mao talks about how opposites, how contradictions are not always in antagonism with each other, but some fundamentally are. The contradiction between the bourgeois and the proletariat is fundamentally in contradiction with each other. Eddie of the American Communist Party, I'm speaking to fucking you. I'm speaking of fucking you. It's always in contradiction with each other. And how dare you use Mao's image for your stupid, shitty party? Anyways, opposites in their struggles do not always have to develop a stage of antagonism. But that is an important way in which contradictions do express themselves. So antagonisms are an important way in which they do come about. For example, two classes may take centuries before they even develop into an antagonism. But once that contradiction does develop into antagonism, an open antagonism, it resolves itself through revolution. So for example, the peasantry and noblemen, the nobility of Russia, existed together for thousands of years, right? That antagonism took thousands of years for it to openly develop, before finally the peasantry, in alliance with the proletariat, overthrew the nobility in open antagonism in the February Revolution, which was the capitalist revolution of Russia, and the October Revolution, which was the communist revolution of Russia. And for example, the proletariat and the bourgeois have existed together for hundreds of years. There's always been antagonism between this relationship, always labor strikes and heavy suppression. But eventually, this will go into such a high level of antagonism that it will resolve itself through revolution. Mao himself uses the metaphor of a bomb. And I quote, "Before it explodes, a bomb is a single entity in which opposites coexist in given conditions." So gunpowder, things like that. The explosion takes place only when a new condition, ignition, is present. An analogous situation arises in all those natural phenomenon which finally assume the form of open conflict to resolve old contradictions and produce new things. So what Mao means by this is that only when the conditions are right, only when, for example, the productive forces are right, does an old contradiction resolve itself. in this way, in open antagonism, in revolution. For example, let's go back to the example of the peasantry within Russia. For thousands of years, the peasantry of Russia existed alongside the nobility. And of course, there was antagonism. There were peasant uprisings. We cannot ignore that. But it was not until an industrialized proletariat that was educated, that was able to read, that was politically able to exert itself in cities, in urban centers, that was able to exchange ideas, that was able to organize itself as a force, came in alliance with the Russian peasantry that finally allowed them to overthrow and kill their noble overlords. The same thing in China. It wasn't until China was colonized and became a semi-feudal country that was implemented within all these global supply chains that the Chinese peasantry finally became a revolutionary class that was able to overthrow their tenant landlords, and they were able to kill their landlords. In Minecraft, of course, I do not advocate violence on this podcast ever, and I've never advocated violence once in my life. And so this is how antagonistic contradictions are solved, and they're only solved when the conditions become right. However, not all contradictions are antagonistic. While some are, like class conflict between the ruled and the rulers, the antagonism always remains. There are some that are not antagonistic. I keep on going back to the proletariat and the peasants. In the Soviet Union, this did not need to be resolved through open conflict. They allied with each other in order to overthrow the Tsar. And contradictions that were once non-antagonistic can become antagonistic. Vice versa, non-antagonistic contradictions can become suddenly antagonistic. Such as bourgeois. One good example is how bourgeois ideas permeate communist parties. Bourgeois ideas get into the minds of communist parties and ideologies of communist parties, which lead to open, ugly conflicts. But this isn't important in some stages. For example, in Soviet Russia, the Bolsheviks did not have an ideological split between Stalin and Trotsky in 1917. There was a non-antagonistic contradiction there. The contradiction between Stalin and Trotsky did not matter. However, once bourgeois ideas permeated into the Bolshevik party, once Trotsky's crazy ass ideas got into there, and once the Russian Revolution really developed further and Russian society developed further past its revolutionary stages, suddenly this contradiction that was not antagonistic between Trotsky and Stalin and didn't matter suddenly became very antagonistic, and you had this huge purge of the Communist Party and Soviet society and the banishment of Trotsky because of his stupid fucking ideas. Ultimately, antagonism and contradiction, as Mao says, are not all one and the same. Under socialism, the first will disappear, the second will remain. And what is that he is saying here is that antagonism is one form, but not the only form of the struggle of opposites. The formula of antagonism cannot arbitrarily be applied everywhere. And just because we get revolution, just because we close the gap between a lot of antagonism within society, doesn't mean that those contradictions still are not there. And that's a big mistake that Soviet society made. Stalin, for example, believed that the class struggle was over, and it was not. Khrushchev came to power because he believed that all contradictions had disappeared within the Soviet Union because of the social revolution. No. There were still contradictions between a Soviet bureaucracy that wanted to be petty bourgeois, and class struggle and capitalist ideas infiltrating the Soviet Union. And so just because these contradictions were not necessarily antagonistic within Stalin's lifetime, because socialism closed the gap of them, does not mean that those contradictions disappeared. And so that is Mao's On Contradiction. And it is a just beautiful work on dialectical materialism, on contradictions, on giving average people a framework on how to view societies, how to view class struggle, how to view even the universe itself, and how to get their Marxist analysis going. Mao in this work really provides you a great tool, right, to go on and form your own analyses of societies, how societies work, how contradictions work, how class antagonisms work, and allows you to help analyze the world, helps analyze current day problems, help analyze even past issues if you're like a nerd and like feudalism. So in this, On Contradiction, in my opinion, is one of the greatest Marxist works ever produced. It should be an introductory text, should be on your reading list, and it's fairly short. It's less than 50 pages. I read it on Marxist.org, which is free. And there's plenty of also audiobooks on YouTube that are free of On Contradiction by tons of YouTubers. So read On Contradiction. It gives you a wonderful summary of hundreds of years of philosophy in a way that you can easily understand, and allows you to use a framework, a magnifying glass, for examining the world in a Marxist way in order to truly resolve issues, in order to truly solve problems. And that's all I have to say. You know, Mao does a really good job at showing you how to think dialectically, not fall into dogmatism, not fall into simple black and white thinking, but how to think of the world as a dance, a beautiful dance. And that is dialectics. It is recognizing that the world is a beautiful dance between opposing forces. And how these forces eventually play out, how eventually one dancer wins, how eventually one dancer compromises the other and triumphs over the other. This is how the universe works. This is how physics works. This is how mathematics works. And this is how human societies work. And if we want to understand how to get revolution done, if we want to understand even revolutionary optimism, why revolution is inevitable, we have to understand contradiction. Thank you. I'm gooning right now. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it. And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Mateus T. If you'd like to also get a shout out, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Subscribing to our Patreon also gets you access to episodes up to a month early, which is insane. Because my upload schedule is insane. I'm not going to lie, fellas.